I've always really enjoyed reading biographies about famous writers. I love to see what it is from their own lives that they have taken and used when it comes to their fiction, their poetry, their plays, whatever it might be. I love to learn about the person behind books that I have enjoyed. A book I have particularly enjoyed recently when it comes to good literary biography is Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder by the author Caroline Fraser. This book was published in 2017 and it won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. I can see why. I thought it was an absolutely superb book, held my interest from beginning to end, and I learned an enormous amount from this book. As a child, I really enjoyed reading the novels of Laura Ingalls Wilder. I made my way through Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, The Long Winter, by the shores of Silver Lake and on the banks of Plum Creek. I love to picture young Laura and her sister Mary, the different adventures that they had, and the very loving family with Pa and Ma, and the protection that they had in the little homes as they moved around as settlers in America. Then, of course, I also, like millions of children around the world, watched the television adaptation, Little House on the Prairie. I think I had something of a crush on Michael Landon, who played Pa Ingalls in the series. I was aware that a lot of changes were made in the television series from the books that I had enjoyed, but as a child, I accepted all of that fairly uncritically. This biography, Prairie Fires, has taught me so much about the woman behind the books and the television series. Laura Ingalls Wilder died in 1957, and that's just a few years before I was born. So her lifetime is not so far from my own. And yet she was born in a little log cabin in the woods of Wisconsin. And then, as a young child, she was taken by her parents and with her sister in a covered wagon across the prairies and the plains of America. They lived a hard life, with Pa building their shelter and planting crops, the children all having to help with the household tasks. But there was great love within the family. And so Laura always felt loved and cherished by her parents. Her father seems to have been a very accomplished musician and loved playing the fiddle. So the songs and the tunes that echoed through her childhood were a much treasured and valued part of her young life. And Caroline Fraser writes very movingly of Pa, his fiddle, and the songs that he sang and played. Now, the childhood might have been full of love, but it was also packed with privations. It was certainly not an easy life. On one occasion, Pa plants all of his crops, and then a terrible plague of locusts arrive, and the crops disappear completely thanks to the locusts. The family has to cope with fire. They have to cope with illness. Laura did have a little brother. He died as a baby. And then later on, her beloved sister Mary goes blind as the result of an illness. So it was really interesting to learn about the hardships, the politics, the political decisions that had an impact on the lives of the Ingalls family. All of it was a really fascinating read, learning more about this interesting woman. Laura Ingalls fell in love with a young man with the most unusual name of Almanzo Wilder, and she married him when she was still a teenager. She and Almanzo decided to move away from the area where her parents were living and to read of her farewell to her parents, Pa playing the beloved songs for the last time for his daughter, made for really very moving reading indeed. So Laura and Almanzo set off. She did end up going back home when her father died, and then she said goodbye to her mother, and her mother lived on for another 20 years, but she never saw her daughter Laura again. They corresponded, but in those days, it was not easy to just travel off to see family and friends when you had no money and you were the wife of a struggling farmer. Almanzo had health problems and they got into terrible financial difficulties. And Caroline Fraser explains all of that in her book. They also had a daughter. There was another baby who died, but the daughter, Rose, grew up to become, most interestingly, a writer. And her story is wonderfully intertwined with that of Laura in the biography. Rose Wilder Lane found work for herself as a journalist. Actually, she sounds like a very strange sort of writer. She would decide to write a biography of somebody, for example, Charlie Chaplin or Jack London or Henry Ford, and she didn't let facts stand in her way. She made things up as she wished and embroidered all sorts of things. And when the poor subject of the biography or that person's relatives complained, Rose was completely blasé about it. She couldn't care less. She said, oh, they probably just want some of my money. She was an exceedingly unscrupulous journalist. I think that Rose Wilder Lane was also a very troubled and unhappy woman. And it's intriguing to learn about her childhood, growing up with Laura and Almanzo, her parents, and seeing where it is that she sort of goes off the rails so badly and what turns her into the very troubled adult that she became. However, it is thanks to Rose that probably we have Laura's novels at all, because Rose, first of all, working as a journalist, encouraged her mother also to write some articles, which might bring in some much needed money. And then as time went by and Laura heard about the death of her mother, childhood memories came flooding back. And she sat down and she began to write the novels that would become American classics. What was also really fascinating was the working relationship between mother and daughter, because Laura would send Rose the manuscripts and Rose would advise her, would edit, would make changes. Correspondence went back and forth between the two before eventually the manuscript was sent to a publisher. And it's impossible for the biographer to really know how much input Rose had on her mother's novels. Certainly she had a part to play, and some people have claimed she wrote most of the books, but it was really fascinating to try to work out just how important she was in the creation of the novels. Rose did have a reasonably successful career as a writer herself, but none of her books have really remained in the public consciousness. It was Laura who was the great writer and not her daughter. But the whole relationship between the two of them I found absolutely fascinating within this, as I say, truly excellent biography. Now, Rose was troubled in that she didn't have her own child, but she seemed to always be wanting to sort of adopt other people's. And she spent a lot of money on these young people that she took up and tried to mother, and she tried to sort of control their lives. When Laura died in 1957, not all that long after taking her first aeroplane flight over America, so fascinating to think that at the start of her life she was in a covered wagon, at the end of her life she was in an aeroplane. Her money, of course, her literary estate went to her daughter. But Rose doesn't seem to have treated that very sensibly. She passed it on to one of these sort of adopted children of hers. The estate in many ways got badly abused. And the legacy, all discussed at the end of the biography, really made for extremely interesting and I think controversial reading in the book. Not terribly long after Laura Ingalls Wilder died, the home in which she had spent the last years of her life got turned into a museum. That too has been extremely interesting. Libraries were named after her and a literary award was established in her name. Caroline Fraser discusses some of the controversy now associated with her name. In one of her books, as little Laura is being taken by her parents into an area that's very unpopulated indeed, Laura has written of that experience, there were no people there, there were only Indians. Now today, of course, such remarks are seen as very cruel and deeply thoughtless. Laura never thought about it in that way until Many years after the book had first been published, a young girl wrote to her and complained about that sentence, saying, well, you know, I'm Indian and we lived there and it was our land and your book should not make such a statement. After that, the offending lines were removed from the book. Today, these lines still linger, they still leave a bad odour, and there has been much discussion about whether a prize should still be in Laura Ingalls Wilder's name, should there be museums honouring her legacy, and all of this controversy is discussed in the biography, and again, in a most interesting and extremely readable way. She also moves on to talk about the television adaptation that I had enjoyed as a child. As I mentioned, I did have something of a crush on Michael Landon, so I was really, really interested to read about his lack of underpants in the series, the fact that he was taking his shirt off extremely frequently to show his well-oiled biceps, and the way in which he controlled the whole program. Yes, he was one of the major actors, but he was also writing scripts and directing, so he was very much in charge. I have to say that my crush on Michael Landon evaporated completely as I finished reading that particular chapter. It was really quite eye-opening to see just how the television adaptation had helped to manipulate and shape the legacy of Laura Ingalls Wilder. So this was a biography that I can very, very, very strongly recommend, even if you haven't read Little House in the Big Woods or Little House on the Prairie or any of the other books. This is still a biography that will teach you about American history. We learn about the politics that shaped Laura's life. We learn about the technological changes that, of course, made an enormous difference to her. There's discussion of locusts, of religion, of politics, of educational systems. This is a history book as well as being a really, really fine biography. I found it a wonderful read. I felt sad when the book came to an end. I hope I have recommended it to you and that you might consider reading and getting the sort of pleasure from this book that I have recently received. Long live biographers who write biographies of wonderful novelists.